go ahead and introduce Doug. You ready, Doug?
Yes, I am.
Great, okay. So Doug Duncan is our guest, and Doug is of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Many of you know Doug and his work. We're very happy to have him present about the native fishes in the Santa Cruz Basin, the threats to native fish and their habitats, and the changes that have occurred to Upper Cienega Creek since its acquisition by the BLM. So thank you for being here, Doug. And,
you're welcome. Thank you for having me. Okay. Native fish conservation in the Santa Cruz Basin, and specifically what's going on and has been going on in the Sonoita Plain. That's a picture of me there, just deep in the headwaters of Cienega Creek. Looks like I'm measuring emergent vegetation. First off, I would like to dedicate this to Jeff Sims, recently retired Jeff Sims. This talk would be very different if Jeff Sims had not been there and championed a lot of work with native fishes and aquatic habitats. And also Jesse Jewin, who helped kick off the collaborative cooperative conservation planning process when they started that back in the mid-90s, and certainly set the stage for this group and what has been accomplished over the last 25 years. So hasta la vista, Jeff. So he'll still be around. He's actually still helping me with some top minnow stuff. So yeah, I'm talking about fish, but Las Ciénegas has a lot of different attributes, which a lot of people care about, and a lot of people think, especially mammals and prairie dogs, are really cute. But we're here to talk about the important things. So there'll be no more mammal or bird pictures. I want to start off with threats, because that helps frame what has gone on in the past, but also what we've been doing now as far as conservation of aquatic systems and their watersheds, and what we hope to do and need to do in the future. As far as aquatic species and aquatic habitats, it's pretty much the same threat worldwide to native fishes. First one being non-indigenous species, which depending on the terminology you use also means non-native, invasive, bad species, things we don't want, things that humans have moved around for various reasons. Additionally, there's been habitat loss, as evidenced by that picture. That's obviously not going to be fish habitat, because if there was a stream there, it's probably gone now. However, there are other types of habitat loss, which is a reduction in habitat quality, which, as the text states there, is the main factor for the increasing endangerment of all native species throughout the world, but especially for North American aquatic species. That specific metric comes there from analysis that was done in the early 80s, and I'm sure it is still true now. In addition, you could have water that still occurs in places. Fish need water. And we are lucky that we still have water in some of our streams, including the Santa Cruz River, even though it comes out of wastewater treatment plants. And if the water quality is good enough, which because of upgrades in the 3 treatment plants that discharge to the Santa Cruz River, it is now fish habitat, including below 2 of those wastewater treatment plants. Gila top minnow are present, and at least in one of those areas thriving. They're the most numerous species in the Nogales Reach. However, because it's wastewater, there's a lot of other things and contaminants that we have that comes out in those waters, which can affect fish and aquatic ecosystem health. As far as Gila top minnow are concerned, they're potentially a little luckier because they only tend to live about a year. They're a little less susceptible to chronic effects from those things, from those sorts of contaminants though I'm not aware of too much research on the effects of those sorts of contaminants that we see in wastewater treatment on short-lived species. You tend to see it more for longer-lived species such as bass, catfish, and those sorts of species. Of course, here in the Southwest, we're fully familiar with drought being in an arid system. It's a natural part of an arid ecosystem. We get droughts periodically. The climate change is another factor thrown on top of that, which appears will and in some minds has already increased the drought. The drought we're in, many theorize, has come about because of climate change. This picture right here is actually in the ag fields area of Cienega Creek. That's Jeff Sims there doing one of the things he did well, was teaching people. This was an area, one of Jeff's big projects, the stream restoration project, which put all the flow of the stream back into the creek, removed the flood flows down the so-called Panama Canal. And it looked pretty good the first couple of years, but this is probably about 4 or 5 years ago, one of the biological planning team meetings. And because the groundwater tables were lessening, flows were lessening, this area was starting to unravel for many reasons, not just the loss of water, but also caused a reduction in plant vigor. But as you can see, there's a head cut starting there. That's one of the potential impacts from drought on streams that we've seen in our own Cienega Creek. This is a shot of another spring system in the San Rafael Valley, Sharp Spring. That's a staff gauge there that's there to monitor water level. As you can see, it's high and dry. The shot's probably about 15 years ago. That system has only gotten worse since then. So the non-indigenous, non-native species. This is the northern virile crayfish, which is it's a North American species that's been moved worldwide, including Arizona. It can cause a host of problems, but we are lucky that Cienega Creek does not have them. Actually, one of the reasons that Cienega Creek is so valuable, it basically has no aquatic invaders. This used to be in Klein Pond, which is in the headwaters of Cienega Creek. It used to be owned by Doc Klein, was gifted to the BLM, but a large interagency group got rid of those crayfish. Possible they occur in other private ponds in the area, but as far as we know, we got rid of those at least. Additionally, non-native fish, Gambusia, also known as the mosquito fish, is hell on Gila top minnow. It has caused the loss of certain Gila top minnow populations in less than 3 years. Sometimes it can take decades. It really depends on the size of the system and the habitat complexity. Recently, a population of mosquito fish was found in Sweetwater Dam, which is in the headwaters of Gardner Canyon. There were also goldfish there, and a multi-agency group addressed that issue. It would have been an exigent threat if they had gone down Gardner Canyon to Cienega Creek. While they may not have caused the extirpation of Gila top minnow there, it would have had a huge impact on the population health for the Gila top minnow. So don't spread around mosquito fish. One of the other names for them, actually there are two other names. One is Dambusia. The other one is Gambusia, the fish destroyer, because of their name, they've been moved worldwide, ostensibly for mosquito control, though most native fishes can do the same thing. If they had been called something else other than mosquito fish, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Lastly, this is a green sunfish, but it's another example of the non-native fish that have been moved around, largely sport fish in the bass and catfish's family for for sport fish in the West, in addition to forage fishes used to support them, such as threadfin shad and fathead minnow. I used the green sunfish because in the Game and Fish records, there's actually only one record of a legal stocking. Granted, in the old days, the wildlife managers probably moved fish around in a bucket, but it was released in Sabino Canyon in the 1930s, and practically every small stream in southeastern Arizona, though they may not have them now, but may have had them in the past, had green sunfish. And I don't even know why, because in small streams, they're not even hardly worth fishing for and eating. But that's my perspective. So, fishes. In the state of Arizona, depending on how you count them, there are about 35 native species. 21 are listed. 6 are managed under what we call conservation agreements, which tries to address their management and conservation of a species that is becoming more rare before it becomes listed under the Endangered Species Act. One of our species is extinct. There are a couple others that no longer occur in the state. So the Gila River Basin, of which the Santa Cruz is a part, most of which occurs in Arizona, about 25% is in New Mexico. In Mexico, 17 native species, 12 are listed, 2 under a conservation agreement, and there's still that same one extinct species. In the Santa Cruz Basin, this is a little kind of busy map here. Tucson there, Nogales, Sonoita, Las Ciénegas. There are 8 native species, 4 listed under the act, and there's the 1 extinct species, which is the only extinct species in Arizona. Santa Cruz River Basin, upper, middle, lower. Hydrologists and fish biologists like to break up streams into different reaches. And for a larger system, it's usually just referred to as upper, middle, and lower. When you look at smaller stream segments, sometimes we come up with different names. But one of the reasons I bring this up is because it's a pet peeve with what we tend to call the reaches of the river, especially in Tucson. So most people refer to the Santa Cruz River in Tucson as the lower reach. I take quite umbrage with that. Tucson is actually about halfway down the reach of the river from its headwaters in the San Rafael Valley and the Canelo Hills to where it drains into the Gila River there. So I would call the upper river, the blue line there between Tubac and Nogales, I would call the break right there around Sonoita Creek for 2 main reasons. Usually the breaks for these are hydrological, geological, especially when looking at an entire stream system. But one of the reasons I make the break there is because the Nogales International Wastewater Treatment Plant dumps in a lot of water, which changes the hydrology and certainly ecology of the river there, but also Sonoita Creek and Potrero and Nogales Wash run in here, so it greatly increases the size of the river. Also just upstream of there, both Nogales, Arizona, Sonora remove water from the floodplain, which really dries up that section, which makes the addition of the larger watershed and the water from the treatment plant, it makes a big change to that river. The break for the lower river I use about right there, which generally should correspond to where Red Rock Road is, but that is about the start of the Santa Cruz River Flats, which are vastly different than anything else in the watershed. It's a distributary system. There's no real main channel there. Humans have created additional channels to try to shunt flood water around. If you've ever been over I-8 and seen the sign for the Santa Cruz River, you probably missed the channel. So, off my soapbox now. Next. Here's our extinct species of the Santa Cruz pupfish. Monkey Springs, which occurs about halfway between Patagonia and Sonoita, has always had um, 3 listed fishes in it. Well, it did. Initially, the so-called Monkey Springs pupfish was there. It became extinct in the 70s. Additional work about 20 years ago found out that this fish also occurred in the Santa Cruz River Basin, mainly in the Santa Cruz, in the Tucson area, was the same as what was in the Monkey Springs pupfish, and because they were restricted to the Santa Cruz Basin, it was thus named the Santa Cruz pupfish. But it is still extinct, even though it has a wider distribution than we hope. I hope that someone somewhere picked those fish up and they're in someone's aquarium or backyard pond somewhere, and they're not actually extinct. One of my fantasies as a fish biologist. So Sonora sucker, we have 2 suckers in the basin. We're not sure these are still here. Their last place of occurrence was upper Sonoita Creek, but we do surveys on a lot of these streams, but we tend to go 1 or 2 spots once a year. So picking up rare species can be difficult. The advent of environmental DNA is vastly changing that scene though, and picking up rare species is becoming much, much easier because of the use of environmental DNA. The other sucker that occurs here, desert sucker, as you can see from the map, occurs through a wide range of areas in the southwestern United States. It still occurs in Sonoita Creek. I found it in the Santa Cruz River in 2006 in Mexico, which, as far as I know, is the last real fish survey on the Santa Cruz in Mexico. Speckled dace also only occurs in Sonoita Creek. There has been some interest in moving it into Sabino Canyon. We do have some backup populations of this lineage of speckled dace. Now getting into the fish that also occur in Cienega Creek, longfin dace. Most common species that we have, the native species, because it's a habitat generalist, it likes sandy streams, which, as you know, if you've been in any streams in this area, we've got plenty of those. This is a species that lives 2, 3, maybe 4 years. They'll get to about 3 inches or so. This is probably the fish that has led to stories from various people about fish showing up in the rain or things like that, because they're expert pioneers for new water. They have been seen following down the front of a flood, heading down a dry stream. Desert pupfish, though it did not occur here historically because we no longer have our native pupfish, we have released desert pupfish into the Santa Cruz River Basin, including on to Los Cienegas. Helichub occurs in Cienega Creek. It's one of its best populations, another endangered species. The longfin dace is the only one that's not endangered on Cienega Creek. Lastly, my favorite, the Gila top minnow. They're very much smaller than the photos on the screen. That's a black male on the left. At maturity, they will be about 1 inch. The best way to identify a population of Gila top minnows generally if you see black males, because most of the non-native species we have, actually all of the ones that we have, do not have blackened males, so it's a key diagnostic. Additionally, because it's a sexually dominant, they will almost always be following the female, which is on the right there on the top. Normally they will get to about 2 inches. They are actually live bearers. They're in the same family as the guppies and also the same family as mosquito fish. Cienega Creek is also one of the best remaining natural populations of the Gila top minnow. And as I alluded to, I believe that the Nogales Ridge of the Santa Cruz is on par with Cienega Creek as being a great population for Gila top minnow. It's been endangered a long time. It was initially called the commonest fish in the lower Colorado River Basin. There are a few other aquatic species that occur on Las Ciénegas. There's this aquatic, semi-aquatic plant, Machuca water umbel, which is hard to photograph and have show up in photos. It doesn't get much of a flower, but Ciénega Creek has a very good population that's actually increased over time. Chiricahua leopard frog also occurs there, and with a lot of the work that the various frog partners have done, it has a pretty good population throughout that valley in the wetlands, stock tanks, and in some places the creek also. Mexican garter snake, also another listed species. Used to have a fairly good population in Ciénega Creek. I'm not sure what its status is now. Golden leopard frog also occurs in the lower sections of Ciénega Creek, more on the county's portion, north of I-10. It is not listed, but has been generally declining, as many of our native aquatic species are. Just larger photos of our Gila top minnow. They're actually trying to mate. If you see this structure here, that's the modified anal fin of the male, which they use to inseminate the female. That's how the live bearers transfer sperm to the female. Females can have actually multiple broods developing at one time, and potentially from multiple males. Just another shot of a male and female. Who can't love Gila top minnow? Look at that. So I want to drill down a little further to some of the things that we've seen on Ciénega Creek over the years with changes in management, largely to livestock management specifically on the creek, but also just to more focused and better management on the watershed also on Las Ciénegas. Most of this work was done and reported on almost 15 years ago now by Gita Bodner, Jeff Sims, and Karen Sims. Certainly it would be something to look at after an additional 15 years of drought. I'm hoping that Jeff would write things up like this. I'm not sure if he's going to or not, but so the analysis was basically from 1990, which was shortly after BLM acquired the property. And then they did a lot of follow-up surveys on various fish habitat and other factors that they looked at, some of which I'll touch on here. So basically when it looks at from 1990 to 2000, which really the drought had only started around 2000. It varies a year or two depending on where you are in southeastern Arizona. Ciénega Creek on the NCA is broken up into two reaches, which we call the upper and lower. The differences there are shown. The base flow in the upper reach, which is red, a break pretty much where Empire Gulch comes in, right there around the property line. Something that's different about it is the slope or the gradient of the stream is actually less in the upper section, the headwaters. Streams tend to do the opposite of that. The further down the stream you get, the less the slope usually is. And that's one of the reasons you see some of the changes that we've seen also. Of course, the watershed size is different between the two, and the lengths are slightly different. And some of the things that they saw over time, and this is, as I said, largely due to how livestock were managed beginning in about the mid-90s. The rancher actually started fencing off some of the creek on his own because there had been a history of better and better livestock management, that the creek was actually beginning to get more marshy. It was actually proving problematic or the livestock permittees. At the time, it was John and Mac Donaldson, because cows could get stuck in there. They would actually have livestock die when they got stuck in that marshy stream. So they started fencing out some of those areas. And it wasn't just because they were losing livestock, it was because they cared about the creek. And as they learned more about that management, they stepped up to start fencing the creek, which BLM continued. And to this day, most of the creek is fenced. There's a few crossing areas. And of course, you can't keep cows out of places. Fences go down, cows jump, go through, go under. So there is livestock use periodically, but it's nowhere near the scale that it used to be in the past. So some of these changes that we've seen are things that you would expect with a reduction in livestock grazing, but to look at them, and especially when you're really only looking at 5 years of time, are really striking. The red is the upper reach, which again has less of a stream gradient. So what you expect on depth of habitat when you're removing livestock is that it increases because there's less impact. The stream can go more towards its natural state of what it wants to be, which is a narrowing of the stream and generally an increase in depth. And you can really see that in the depth of the upper reach pools, which is that top red line, where it's going from a half meter to almost a meter, and that's about 18 inches to 34 inches, so almost a doubling in basically 5 years. You see a similar trend for the lower reach pools, where they almost doubled, but they were not as deep to begin with. Having been in there last week, I can say that, yeah, they're well, some of them are over 2 meters now, as are some of the pools in upper reach, but this is average. So this is the width, which, as I said, normally with a stream where you've had livestock removed, the width will decrease. Well, you'll see one in there that is definitely not the case, and that is upper reach marsh. So, and again, the upper reach has less gradient. It was 0.6% as opposed to 0.8 on the lower reach. So what's happening here? There was a lot more water. There was a lot more vegetation because it was moving a lot more slowly. So what happened is, you'll see that's marsh. So what happened, the marsh expanded laterally away from the stream. So the width of that marsh almost doubled there also. And for most of the other types of habitats, riffle, runs, and pools, the width of the channel, the active channel, the stream, decreased. Another part of the story is what happened with the vegetation in the riparian area. As most people would suspect, when you remove livestock, then your vegetation increases, and you can see that that's the case. And the increases have been spectacular on both the upper and lower reach. And the average canopy cover, which includes the woody, but also includes that emergent vegetation, which I was measuring in that early photograph, and in-channel vegetation. Another thing you expect to see in functioning streams, and you expect to see more of in healing streams, is undercut bank. One of the reasons we measure undercut bank is it's important for a lot of fish, and then for Seneca Creek, it's mainly for the chub because they're very secretive. They like to hide out, so they like undercut bank, root wads, and emergent vegetation. So this is probably the biggest difference between any of the variables I'm showing here. Is the amount of undercut bank was basically non-existent on the lower reach, and it has made a huge increase, or did make didn't make from 1990 to 2000. I'm sure it's increased since then because the creek has continued to heal. So to bring in some of those factors in here with what has happened over with Gila top minnow population over time. That's what the function of the paper that I mentioned by Bodner, Sims, and Sims looked at and tried to determine why we were seeing these trends, which are illustrated here. Again, red is the upper slope. As you can see over time, the abundance of top minnow has decreased. Well, how can that be if our stream is getting quote unquote healthier? We've got deeper pools, undercut banks. Well, Gila top minnow tend to like streams that have high primary productivity, which you tend not to get from shaded streams for a couple reasons. They prefer algae and those things that depend on sunlight to drive the ecosystem. Once you have a lot of vegetation, especially shading vegetation from trees, you get less of that. Additionally, in those now tree-dominated systems that we have, especially in the Upper Creek, and also probably because of the drought that has occurred over the last 20 years. Something else has occurred there is the upper pools in the headwaters have become anoxic. They actually do not have enough oxygen to maintain fish. And Gila top minnow are really tolerant of low oxygen. They can go down to 1 part per million, which is pretty low for most fish. To compare, a trout probably needs a minimum of 8. They can survive short periods less, but they do only 8 parts per million. One of the things we also saw with the cessation of grazing in the Upper Creek is the headwaters where it had historically been actually started moving upstream. Because of the increased vegetation and sedimentation, it was capturing more water, and the headwaters actually started moving until the drought hit, and then it's basically moved downstream of where the historical headwaters were. But it's still anoxic. It's probably because of the shading, which inhibits the movement of oxygen into the water column. There's a lot of junk from the trees falling in. When things degrade in the water, they use up a lot of oxygen. And even further down where there are still fish, when we do our fish sampling, one of the great things that's happened on San Diego Creek also is since Jeff started there in about 1990, he's done near annual fish surveys, and you don't have that in a lot of streams in Arizona or indeed the southwestern United States. So we have a good record of what's happening with the fish there. So you don't see those changes in the lower reach there, even though it's had a greater increase in tree cover, especially because it's further down in the system and it probably has more flushing flows from flood. The negative impacts, especially to dissolved oxygen, doesn't occur because the system is regularly flushed out. So it's not as dominated by woody cover and plant debris, tree leaves, tree branches falling into the water and decaying. They tend to get moved through the system quicker. And even though we have lost, in theory, numbers of Gila top minnow on an upper reach, again, it is still the best natural population that we have on public lands, and certainly on par with the Nogales Reach of the Santa Cruz River, which is largely on private land except for Tumacacori National Historical Park. Just touch a little bit and may generate some additional discussions. One of the other threats, of course, is not just the use of surface water, but also on groundwater. As you can see, the green dots in here are wells that have actually gone up over time, and most of those are along the creek, which certainly reflect the changing hydrology and ecosystem along the creek itself, largely due to livestock management. But some of the others that are further out and also closer to human uses have decreased over time. And you'll find this throughout the Cienega Creek system, all the way down to the Pantano. So, I think you told me about 20 minutes, so a little bit more, Tom, but I'm ready for questions or discussions. Since I don't have a webcam, I can run through additional photos, for the people asking questions can go on the screen. I'll leave that to your discretion.
Yeah, I think some photos would be great as we wait for questions.
Okay, and I'll put this up, and I'm easy to find, not online, so feel free if you have additional questions regarding the fish, Cienega Creek Endangered Species Act. Don't hesitate to contact me. But if it's a tough question, if Cat Crawford is still on here, I'll send you the cat.
Here's one. Robert asks, what about beavers in the watershed?
Yeah, that's been I was going to put a beaver picture, darn it. Yeah, that's something that we've discussed for a long time during our management and planning for Lost Cienegas. And Jeff Sims has worked on it. And it would have happened a long time ago if Jeff didn't have other things to do. He didn't get it finished before then. There's actually a draft environmental assessment that they're working on to allow for the release of beavers there. Beavers certainly are ecosystem engineers, and more than likely in this system would lead to an increase in the amount of water that's kept on the landscape there. The more you slow water down, the more that it infiltrates into the groundwater there, especially near-term or near-stream sediments. Recent Holocene alluvium, as some might refer to it and know. It will cause changes in the amount of woody vegetation is there, not only because they like to cut things down and eat them, especially the cottonwoods, but some of the trees can't handle too much flooding, and if they're in the way, they'll cut them for their dams. So if they would open up the system more, they would keep more water in that upper watershed, and it would be released slower over time rather than just running off and running through Tucson and wind up and drying in the Santa Cruz Flats. I'm somewhat concerned after seeing some other recent happenings with the beaver populations that have become established in southern Arizona. With the continued drying, one graphic I did not put in is the results of the wet-dry mapping that they do in June that show drastically the loss of perennial habitat that has occurred on the upper Cienega Creek. So I'm concerned that there might not be enough habitat for the beavers to maintain there. We'd put them in there 20 years ago. We would potentially be singing a different tune. And they were put on the San Pedro 25 years ago, something like that, and they might be gone. Some in the BLM think that might also be because of poaching, even though certainly the amount of habitat there has been reduced. They showed up in the upper Santa Cruz and the San Rafael about 4 or 5 years ago, but they also appear to be gone now. That doesn't have a lot of perennial water, but it also doesn't have very many trees. So that could have been a 1-2 punch there.
Gotcha. Right. How about another question? Let's see, from Ron. It says, do you have a sense of the potential impact of Rosemont mining on the watershed?
Well, we actually spoke on that because if there's a proposal that may impact listed species, then the Endangered Species Act requires that that action agency, in the case of Rosemont, it was the Forest Service, consult with us. And if we determine that there could be adverse effects, then we do what's called a biological opinion under formal consultation. So we did that. Recently, parts of that biological opinion were thrown out by the court, but our basic analysis for under that consultation was that there would be impacts, would generally not cause drying of the streams. Our analysis was not agreed with many people. BLM folks like to bring up that that's all based on groundwater modeling, which has a lot of problems, especially in fractured zones, which certainly where mines go is generally highly fractured. However, the standard that we use in many of our decisions under the Endangered Species Act, including consultation, is to use the best available science. And even though there are many known issues with groundwater modeling, and indeed pretty much any model, is that there are problems with them, but it is the best available that we have. So using those models, we agreed that there would be impacts, but we didn't think it would lead to drying of the creek. There were certain areas that would be impacted, Empire Gulch especially, which has one of the best leopard frog populations. We also, they ran the models multiple times to create a normal distribution. Don't want to go too deep into the statistics here. It's the classic bell-shaped curve some people may know of, but we used the 97.5 percentile on the upper end of the impacts, so that we were basing our analysis on pretty much a worst case scenario based on the models again, but that was the best we had. It was extremely difficult to do that analysis when many of the modeled impacts were potentially decades, if not hundreds of years in the future, and also kind of a conundrum when most of those impacts were modeled to occur after the mine was going to be closed. So probably don't want to go more into that.
Let's see. So another question. I'll read it from the chat. It says, if I heard you correctly, you mentioned that one contribution of the reduction of Gila top minnow in the upper reaches of Cienega Creek was hypoxic, that the top minnows are pretty tolerant of hypoxia and that their numbers were still decreasing. Does this mean that the upper Cienega Creek is even less friendly to the other species now?
Yes. Certainly the low dissolved oxygen, if it's impacting the Gila top minnow, which are really tolerant, it has affected the other two fish. Their pupfish have not been released into the creek. They've been released into some of the off-channel habitats, some of which I've shown some of the recreated wetlands and stock tanks pupfish have. But yeah, there are no fish. It is fishless in the upper, we don't really test it all the way, but the headwaters, the first maybe 200 meters is fishless because of the oxygen issue, and then they're able to deal with it further downstream. Fish can follow the oxygen. Sometimes when we trap in those areas where the fish still are but have low oxygen, if the fish get stuck in a low oxygen pocket that coincides with our trap, we'll pull a trap and find dead fish sometime. But if they weren't constrained by the trap, they would be able to go wherever the the oxygen is, as long as it's available, good enough for them to be there. So yeah, the headwaters is fishless now. This is not from Los Angeles. It's not from one of the ranchers that we deal with them.
Any other questions, anyone?
Chub in the hand. This is actually the Santa Cruz River in Upper Santa Cruz at the U.S.-Mexico border there. And yes, all of the border there is a fence. So just out of the photo are vehicle barriers on both sides.
Here's a question that came in. It says, what are your thoughts on long-term impacts of climate change on different native and non-native fish populations in this region? Are there certain species, native or even non-native, better suited or adapted to potential increasing temps, less water, etc., i.e. the Gila top minnow perhaps being better adapted to hypoxic conditions?
Yeah, we're actually looking at the listing status of the Gila top minnow. The Arizona Game and Fish Department petitioned to have it changed from endangered to threatened. To help answer those sorts of questions, we convened a climate expert team. It wasn't just climate expert. Tom Marksner was actually on the team. We had hydrologists. We had Jeff Sims, fish biologist, Michael Bogan, aquatic ecologist, Ben Lonely, hydrologist, several climate experts, two from the University of Arizona, one from UNR, to try to get a handle on those questions, and certainly looking at climate change over time and the various scenarios, and the climate folks being able to look more at what the impacts of these broad global climate models are going to mean to our sector of the North American continent, or Arizona, or the Colorado River Basin, have gotten much better in it. The outlook isn't good. One of the things that we tend to do, especially for the Gila top minnow conservation program, which has an active program, largely because of funding from the Bureau of Reclamation, is many of the sites where these fish are being reestablished are similar to the ones on the screen there. I believe this is Maddie Canyon, but a lot of them tend to be higher up in the watershed. Think Muleshoe, streams leading from the Santa Ritas. So one threat they're not going to have is human uses, generally, at least not from groundwater pumping or diversion. And hopefully that those sites are remnants of formerly more extensive streams that will persist. We think that many aquatic species are going to be conservation reliant over time. Potentially that is going to include species that are not listed now, but if we continue to lose our aquatic systems, which has occurred over time, and then the extent of our aquatic systems has decreased over time. So the outlook is not good, but as long as we have people that are working on their conservation and we're able to pick and choose at different sites for where to put fish, we are doing that. Yeah, top minnow is one of the easiest to deal with. I tell people the fish basically needs water without non-natives. They're also very tolerant of warm water, though some of our other native stream fishes are not, which is also a potential impact from climate change, where it might favor non-native species over the natives. This is the Santa Cruz River in Tucson and one of the effluent reaches, but of course, if push comes to shove and we're really limited on water, more of that water might be reclaimed and we might be releasing less into the rivers, and certainly no water, no fish. Santa Cruz River at Tumacacori. Front of a flood coming down the Santa Cruz in Tucson. Incidentally, hope this is near downtown. Hopefully we will be releasing Gila top minnow within the next 2 months to the so-called Heritage Reach, where the city of Tucson Water is releasing, has been releasing reclaimed water.